This podcast is being recorded around Earth Day, and with it, we are highlighting the connection between violence against the land and violence against Native and Indigenous women. Indigenous people have taken the role of being environmental stewards very seriously. With each threat against the land from extractive industries, there has been equal response from Indigenous communities to protect and nurture the earth. OCO, hello everyone. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Leanne Pippin, and I'm a member of Cherokee Nation. Before we get started, let's hear a quick word from NIWRC.
The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center offers culturally grounded resources and materials to support tribal domestic violence programs and grassroots advocates. Learn more at niwrc.org/resources. Today, we are joined by Tia Bahozhoni, who is Dene. Tia is our policy specialist who focuses on health justice and health disparities. One of these is violence on the land and its connection to violence against Native and Indigenous women. Some examples are extractive industries, waste contamination, and shipping industries, which can lead to a rise in human trafficking.
Hi, Tia. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Leanne.
So let's jump right into it. Earth Day was created more than 50 years ago, but land stewardship is not a new concept to Indigenous people.
Yeah, I feel like the idea of protecting, honoring, and living interconnectedly with the land has been a concept, found throughout many Indigenous cultures and like their lifeways. And the concept that the land is something outside of our lives, something that serves us and that we can and some people think we should exploit for our comfort and our gain. Like that seems unnatural almost to most Indigenous cultures, right? I think including Indigenous values and worldviews when it comes to living within land and working with natural resources is necessary, especially to sustain healthy communities. I think that there is a disruption that comes into play, especially lately. It seems like more and more obvious, right? But the disruption comes from violence against the land itself, but it's not just like one action that disturbs the relationship that we have with the land in one specific way. I think the effects are felt throughout the community and throughout a very long period of time.
Like generationally?
Yeah, generationally. When we think of violence, we think of overt, right? We think of like violence directed straight to the body. But in a lot of ways, that violence can be seen in the disruption and like erasure of our cultures. And so I think that extraction practices, capitalistic endeavors to exploit land violence itself is a deliberate attempt to cause harm to people of that land that they're exploiting. This violence against land is also found throughout the process of industrial development. I think when people think of extraction industries, they think of
like oil or coal.
Yeah, I think when people, yeah, for sure. Like when people think of extraction industries, they think of like one specific part of the process, which is like the actual extraction of the resources. But in reality, it's the production and the distribution of resources that also come into play when the negative effects towards Indigenous people come into play. The violence towards the people is wide-ranging, but it's consistent. And you can see that consistency when you consider the high rates of health disparities and the violence against Native women.
So, advocacy for environmental protection has been happening for generations, but especially for indigenous populations, but it's not always addressed in the news. I mean, sometimes we see protests like Standing Rock and stuff that get a lot of press, but most of the time, those aren't big national news stories and they happen in tribal communities. So, how do you see environmental protection coming out more in popular culture?
I think when you see a lot of this information about resiliency coming out in media, it's mostly coming from news sources, and but news changes every day very frequently. So the spotlight of harm against land and harm against native bodies isn't as prevalent as
I mean, I was just thinking about most recently Oppenheimer.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of erasure in the media because we know that there was a whole community in Los Alamos before the lab was even built there. And there's only one line about it in the movie, and it's the main character who says, "Oh, some people come up here for ceremonies sometimes, but that's it." And that's all the acknowledgement that there was about the Native community around Los Alamos. And they don't talk about how people had to move away, how they were displaced because of the lab, and how they're still
Right.
dealing with repercussions from the waste management there. So it's kind of
I think
amazing how this movie can come out and win big best picture, but there's a whole side of it that was never mentioned or discussed.
that's really interesting because, like, if you juxtapose that to another huge movie that was released last year, Killers of the Flower Moon, I think the topic itself is right front and center for a lot of audiences, but the way that it's presented and the way that it resonates with audiences is completely different, right? So with Oppenheimer, you see that history, but it's not given in a context that I think could resonate with folks today. Whereas the Killers of the Flower Moon, that I don't think the message of exploitation leading to violence was lost on anyone who saw that movie, or even knows a little bit about the reign of terror for the Osage Reservation. But I do think it's one of the more obvious attempts from Hollywood to highlight the connection between extraction, exploitation, and violence when it comes to Indian country. And that's something I do appreciate, that that it did bring that to light, and it also brought attention to NIWRC, of course. Like, absolutely appreciate those two things, but I think I would really just hope to see that more media attention comes in the form of movies and going the way that Killers of the Flower Moon went, rather than the way Oppenheimer went.
Yeah, because at
Because
least Killers of the Flower Moon, there were indigenous characters who
yeah,
were able to tell their story from their point of view as well. And I think when you don't have native representation in films, you miss that point of view.
right.
Because how else are you going to show a native person's point of view unless you have them there to show it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it actually connects to the response to extraction and the industry of development, because a lot of the time, the problems that come with extraction or industry development, it starts before breaking ground even begins. It's the lack of consultation. It's the lack of consideration. It's removing what little agency Native people have in voicing their concerns when it comes to these actions against land in their home. So I think, yeah, that's a really good connection of, including Native voices when it comes to media and art and representation. It's the exact same when it comes to, dealings with the land and how we relate to it. I don't think that's a huge ask of, at the very least, consulting and considering the people who live there.
But yeah, you made a good point earlier that I wasn't even thinking about, is that there's a bunch of stages to these industries that could be more inclusive of Native peoples, like every step of the way. And like pre-planning, implementation, and then even like what is this resource going to be going to, what products, what
Right.
materials, and then are those going to end up in a landfill somewhere? Or are they going to end up, is there like waste that we need to be considering? What is going to be left? And when extraction industries leave that area, do they clean up after themselves, or is it just kind of left there for the other residents to kind of pick up the pieces of what's left? Yeah, I think that's just looking at the whole stage was something I never really thought about.
I'd like to share with you, we talked about Killers of the Flower Moon, and even how this pollution and violence against land has been happening for generations, hundreds of years. There are so many examples these days that you can point to and be like, well, here's history kind of repeating itself. You talked about the different steps of these industries coming in and taking from the land. And I think a really good example of that is the proposed lithium mine in Nevada, and how the Fort McDermott Paiute and the Shoshone tribes have to, respond to that in the best way that they know how, which is organizing as community members to protest this proposed mine. If this mine goes through, the creation of this mine itself, and once it starts running, it's going to produce so much carbon dioxide emissions, tons of sulfur, and these two tribes are only located about 15 miles away from the proposed site itself. So when we think of pollution and these extractive industries doing harm, it's not decades ago, it's not during Oppenheimer, it's not during hundreds of years ago, it's not during the 70s. It's continuing to happen.
Yeah. Have you seen There Will Be Blood?
I have. Yeah.
I'm thinking like those extraction industries, since sometimes they're not right on the reservation, they're just outside of the border of the reservation. I can't think of Daniel Plainview and going, I drink your milkshake. Like, that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what he did, is he knew that there was goods to be mined. Well, I mean, he's an oil man, so, but for this example, if there's something in one area, you just build a pipe to that area to get it out. And that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly what people are doing nowadays. Because I think of the comparison to Killers of the Flower Moon, and it's like, well, that happened on the reservation. So they were able to, that's how they were able to keep the profits and benefit from it. And also, the land wasn't as stripped as it was today. It's not in the hands of tribes like it was in that movie,
Yeah. And you think of how little agency there was beyond that, though. Like on paper, sure, the oil was within the tribe's hands, but who was responsible for the financial management of the people who had those land rights? It certainly wasn't Osage individuals, so it's that sort of like insidious manipulation on just getting to the end product. Yeah. Without consideration of the process, without consideration of any sort of long-term effects in any capacity. Yeah.
Because at the end, it's still about control,
Yeah.
about being the ones in control. If they can't be the ones living on the res, they want to be the ones right next to it, taking from the res.
Mm-hmm. And another example of like that sort of inconsideration of the process here nearby where I live, there was a spill about 2015. It's called the Gold's King Mine spill, and
Where is that? Near?
it's in Colorado. So this Gold King Mine spill released so much waste into the Animas River, which flows into the San Juan River, which flows into the Colorado River. And before it gets to the Colorado, it goes straight through Navajo. It goes through a lot of farmland in New Mexico and Utah, right next to Navajo farmlands. And so for a couple of years, many families who rely on the money they gain from crops, selling crops, they couldn't do that. They couldn't sustain themselves financially because of that. So these practices of extracting from the land, even if they're, quote unquote, like long gone and no longer in service or like in use or whatever you'd like to say, they're still harmful. So it's not just the initial extraction. It's the lack of planning, the lack of consulting on what's best for the land that is truly harmful. And I just want to highlight one last example of, we talked about how violence against Native women could be as overt as like, the violence seen around man camps, which I always have to make that connection of the history repeating itself, right? So,
and before you do that, should we just explain what man camps are to maybe someone who doesn't know?
Sure. So in a lot of these areas where oil companies will create sites to extract oil or different other like fracking or any sorts of connection to oil extraction, there are these camps set up by those oil industries to house the workers who, take care of the oil equipment. And these are casually kind of called man camps.
It's essentially
they're just
for the period of time that they're working there.
Yeah, it's exactly. That's a really wonderful way to put it. It's people who come in, outsiders, for a short time, and they occupy the land for a little bit, and then they leave. Within and around a lot of these man camps, there are high rates of violence against women in the form of rape and sex trafficking, and it's really devastating. The fact that it's so widely known right now, but it continues to happen. But the history of violence against Native women around these sort of camps of outsiders is actually very, very long. You can go back to the 18th century and see the first glimpses of prostitution of Native women, and they happen quite a bit around, logging camps. So it doesn't take a ton of imagination to make that connection between logging camps of the 18th century and the violence against Native women back then in the form of, exploitation and prostitution, and man camps today and the high rates of rape and human trafficking.
And NIWRC too in those areas.
Right, yeah. But aside from those like overt examples of straight up violence against Native women and bodies in the form of murder and, women who go missing, there are some instances of human trafficking that aren't as well known, but are connected to that industrial development process we were talking about earlier. In the Great Lakes area, in the Duluth port, actually, it's been reported that there are high rates of human trafficking, women and children being placed in freighters, and the high rates of rape and prostitution on those ships. And actually, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, MUSAC, and they partnered with the Prostitution Research and Education Center, and they created a report that kind of influenced another report specific to that issue of human trafficking on Lake Superior, I think. All of these examples just kind of like highlight how widespread and yet how consistent in its presence violence against Native women is when it comes to violence against the land.
So we know that Native women are negatively affected by extractive industries. What happens to the communities as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because we sometimes, when I'm speculating, obviously I'm generalizing, but I think when we think of Native violence against Native women, it's very individualized. But a lot of this disruption in the way that we naturally have relationships with the land occur, it actually affects the communities as a whole in ways that just create health inequities in general. A very specific example, and like I said, I'm Dene, as you mentioned before. So our history as Dene people includes uranium mining. And I'm going to get a tiny bit personal, if that's okay. But, growing up, it wasn't unusual for many of my classmates to have grandpas or great uncles who, died of lung cancer. And it wasn't because there's this huge surge of, nicotine addiction or whatever on reservations, but it had a lot to do with our grandpas were all uranium miners. And that was a normalized reality for me growing up. And it wasn't until I got older and I went to school away from the reservation that I had, casually mentioned this. My grandpa died of cancer due to uranium mining, and someone who was non-Native was so shocked by that. And I thought it was just such a normal thing. But in reality, even though something is normalized within community based on a traumatizing past, it's not natural, right? And it shouldn't be. Because of that shared history in our community of uranium mining, a lot of us kind of just grew up thinking that was normal, which is very disheartening. And it wasn't until I was much older to really grasp the severity and the sadness that's in that. We say here a lot at NIWRC, violence is not traditional. And I think that's the same for this type of violence against land. The results are hurting our communities on large scales with all these high rates of disease and illness and, chronic health problems. That might seem normalized, but it's not natural, and it's definitely not okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what it would be like to be a child and knowing that whatever occupation your relatives had could be very detrimental for their health. Like knowing they're going to work every day, getting a little bit sicker from what they're doing, and thinking that's normal.
Yeah. And being told nothing is wrong with that, having that reassurance. Because, I doubt my grandpa or any of his coworkers would have done it had the health consequences really been laid out in plain view. Kind of goes back to that whole like consultation and sharing of knowledge of what's going to happen, not being as present as it should be. So even though the uranium mining example is very, personal and very specific to my community, there are other health inequities and disparities. And I know we mentioned Oppenheimer before, and I think the continuation of Los Alamos Labs, their work and what's, the environmental results of their work results in respiratory disease as well, chronic respiratory illnesses in the pueblos around that area. So it's not So it's not just individuals suffering because of extractive industries, it's whole communities and whole generations.
It affects the communities and how they're able to survive and provide for themselves and provide for others.
Yeah, exactly. But I think in their responses, we mentioned resiliency earlier, but it's true. It's not as if we see these things happening and then just kind of like sit down and let it happen. We respond in our own ways, and
Can we talk a little bit about what the response has been from Indigenous and Native communities?
Sure, yeah. So that type of resiliency is found throughout, not just, here in the US and in Native Hawaiian communities, in tribal communities, in Alaska Native villages. It's all over the world. A lot of international responses are ongoing, and they're actually something that I really respect, and I look towards for, the responses that we could possibly have. You look at like Brazilian indigenous communities and you see their legal responses and how successful some of those are, and how conservation efforts that are grounded in indigenous values really do work. You see all of these research and data from this research, and you see that indigenous conservation works, and they are sustainable. Some of our partners, like the Indigenous Law Resource Center, or the Indian Law Resource Center, rather, they work internationally with folks all around the world in a legal framework to get land rights back.
Say, like, that's the whole hashtag land back campaign. It's not. I feel like maybe as an outsider, you could see that and be like, oh, somebody wants their land back and wants to kick other people out of it. And it's like, no, that's not the land back movement. It's about restoring the sovereignty of the land to land stewards who know how to take care of it and protect it, because this land had been occupied for hundreds of years. Historians and researchers have found that this land had been taken care of for generations, and it's only been the past, I don't know, 200 years or so that we've seen the land get so depleted and not be able to sustain itself anymore. And that's because we've done away with the traditional ways of taking care of the land, which requires putting nutrients back into the land, doing controlled burns sometimes, and make it sustainable so that it's actually getting better the more we use it, rather than depleted and stripped. Because if the land is stripped, our food is going to be stripped, and we don't even get as much nutrients out of our food as we used to. David Grann, who is the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, also wrote The Lost City of Z, which is about explorers in Brazil. And near the end of that book, it's not a spoiler, but they do confirm that based on the geology there, native or indigenous populations in Brazil were living much earlier. We're living there much earlier than anybody had guessed. And that just helps inform me of how long people have been on the land and taking care of it and making sure it's thriving. So it's not impossible. It's not a fantasy to think that the land can survive and continue. There's not an expiration date on it, as long as we're sustaining it.
Yeah, I think that sort of research that you were mentioning, there are organizations out there who specifically do work to highlight the importance of Indigenous values in sustainability efforts. Here in Colorado, they have the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Lab up out of Fort Collins. They're really wonderful. You have other organizations like Earth Justice who kind of work in that legal realm, like Indian Law Resource Center. And then you have people who are, grassroots organizing to get information and resources out, like Tewa Women's Society, or down in New Mexico, we have the Coalition to End Violence Against Native Women, and they have a really wonderful resource that's very succinct in understanding what land and body violence actually is. And I'd be happy to share that for all the listeners. And our, here at NIWRC, we continue to try to uplift knowledge keepers so that, we can share the importance of what land stewardship should look like, what land stewardship did look like, where advocacy is going in the space of environmental justice. I know in this past year, we've had a couple of webinars specific to land and body violence. And, and last year we conducted 2 conversations with communities. And the main topic was, interviewing participants about their lived experience and their thoughts and community's experience on land violence and how that affects their community health. And from those 2 conversations with community, we're actually compiling the findings, and hopefully that will be released soon this year, so we can share our recommendations based on those 2 conversations.
For sure. And we'll also include all the resources and companies or organizations listed. So we'll provide a link to those in the podcast description. Yeah, so NIWRC has what's called the 6-point action plan, and we'll post a link of the graphic of it in the podcast description. But basically, it approaches ending violence against Native women through systemic changes that need to happen. So they look at it from every angle, from violence against the land, through MMIW, through barriers in policy, to lack of resources, and even more than that. So how does the 6-point action plan fit into this particular issue?
So the 6-point action plan was actually created with NIWRC and our national partners, and that includes, Indian Law Resource Center, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, Strong Hearts Native Hotline, and several others. So we came together to identify specific systemic barriers that create and sort of uphold violence against Native women. And in response to identifying these barriers, we also identified ways to challenge these barriers. The 6-point action plan is essentially a roadmap to addressing these barriers in the work that we do. So we often look to the 6-point action plan as a way to, determine whether or not we're addressing the priorities we want to, and we're doing it in a way that that prioritizes, families of MMIW, that prioritizes communities that are most affected, that look to advocates for recommendations. It's as holistic as it can be. And we chose 6 based on, like I said, those systemic barriers. And so the 6th point in that is actually that we recognize that both land and Indigenous women are sacred, connected, and must be protected by legislative and policy actions. And we try to share it as much as possible, just so that, people who want to advocate for Native women's rights and protections, or they just want to be a very good ally. Like this is the document that we show them quite a bit, that they can understand where our perspective is coming from.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we'll include a link to that in the podcast description of the 6-point action plan. For this most recent conversations with community, do we know when that will be released?
So yeah, that summary report, which will include the compiled findings from those conversations and include recommendations based on the findings, that will be released within the coming months.
Gotcha. So if you want to look out for that, please make sure to sign up for our mailing list, and we'll include a link to that as well. You can choose what kind of emails you want to get, so your inbox won't be flooded. We don't do that anyway, but you can just click any category that you're interested in learning more about.
And I just want to end the conversation just by, uplifting the work that everyone does around the nation, just in any capacity they can. I know that everything seems incredibly hard these days, like individually, with families, with community, globally, everything seems really, really challenging. And I acknowledge that. And I honor whatever anyone's going through. But even if it's just listening to this podcast, even if it's, understanding the history of the land that you live on, even if it's following a new resource, whatever you can to learn and educate and act.
Share a Mr. Rogers quote. Because when bad things happen and they make me sad, it's like, what do you do to feel better about that? I don't want to leave the situation because then I feel guilty. I want to help. And that's exactly what the quote says, is like, look to the helpers, look at the heroes. If you're seeing on the news disastrous things happen, look at the heroes, look at the people who are helping, and that'll give you hope and help you know what you can do as well to help. So I agree that, like, even just educating yourself and looking at just learning some new information that you didn't know before is a way of helping and a way of participating.
There's a quote from NCAI that says, stewardship means acting responsibly to serve the needs of a community. And a lot of the time, helping someone else out really starts with like understanding how to take care of yourself. And that could be just as simple as like reflecting on how you share space with community, how you share space and environment, how is your relationship with your home, I don't mean to get so esoteric or philosophical, but like I just want to say, like, any effort is appreciated.
Yeah, I don't think we should like be discounting our efforts each day, because change takes time. So just like how we need to take care of the land, we need to take care of ourselves and make sure we can show up every day and be good people.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Wodo, thank you everybody for listening. For more episodes of Speaking Our Truth, Podcast for Change, visit wherever you find your podcasts or niwrc.org/podcast. Take care.